We are now on the home straight for today's panels. We have two more. The next panel, as I've said, will be on the future of the university sector. As somebody who's just spent the last few years as a newcomer coming into the university sector, it is not without challenges, and so we've got an excellent panel on that. Directly after that, our last panel session of the day will be, it's titled America at the Crossroads. At the time we chose that title, we didn't know the outcome of the election, and either way it was going to be at the crossroads, but certainly the last couple of weeks have thrown up a fair bit of volatility, which we'll get into as well. So I will be joined here for the panel on the university sector. It's a sector under review. We've called it University Examinations. Joined here by Professor Neil Quigley, the Vice-Chancellor of Waikato University, so your host for today. This is Neil's whare. In addition to his role as Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Waikato, Neil chairs the Board of Directors for the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and is also a distinguished economist in his own right in his earlier career. Professor Rawinia Higgins from Victoria University of Wellington. She is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Māori and Engagement, also Chair of Te Taura Whiri i Te Reo Māori, the Māori Language Commission, and has also served on the Waitangi Tribunal. And Roger Smyth, who is a consultant and advisor in tertiary education, who has more than 30 years of experience looking at this from a policy lens, and indeed has led tertiary education policy for the government at various times. So we have an eminently capable panel, and we'll try to draw some wisdom out of this. So I thought to start off, I'm conscious in my own background. I came from the private sector and have been working in the university for the last 4 or so years. And the university sector from the inside, frankly, looks quite different from what I imagined it to be as somebody whose primary experience of it was as an undergraduate student. So I'll pass to each of the panelists to make some comments to start, but I might start with you, Neil. Your views more broadly around the sector and what's going on, but also if you can just describe how does the university system in New Zealand work? What are its sources of revenue? What are its main functions? Because I think that's a useful grounding for all of us who are not, well, for many of us who are not experts.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. The first thing to think about with the universities is that though we're part of the wider public sector, the vast majority of our income is at risk and associated with the number of students that we recruit. So about 80% of the university's income comes in the door attached to a student in one way or another, whether that's government funding for that student's study, the tuition fees that they pay, or accommodation that they purchase from us, other services that are add-on for the university. We have a certain amount of underlying research funding, which is often carried over for a number of years, but the vast majority of our income is associated with students. So that was particularly important during the pandemic and in the closure of the borders, because it meant that for all of the New Zealand universities, we had a significant reduction in income as a result of not being able to bring international students into the country. And despite being part of the wider public sector, we did not receive bulk funding to support us in that period. Neither did we receive the sort of funding that private sector businesses received to cover income shortfalls. So it's been a challenging few years in the university sector as a result of that. So if I just go to a slightly wider lens on where we are, the university sector as we know it now is really a product of the period from 1960 until about 2010. And in that period, the number of people who wanted to enroll in universities grew substantially year on year. government funding for the university sector increased as well. And during that period, the big challenge for someone trying to run a university was where they would find qualified people to put in teaching and research roles to support those students who came to the university to want to learn. So in that period, there was a strong driver to reinforce the idea that the universities were in large part places for qualified research staff, and we built up terms and conditions and ways of thinking about the university sector which were effectively driven by the fact that qualified researchers and teaching academics were the scarce resource in the system. So that changed with the reduction in the growth in the number of students looking to come to university in about 2010. And at the moment, we're, I think, in a period of change for the university sector that's made them more difficult because we have locked into legislation a description of the university sector which is the way we came to think about it in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, but is probably not appropriate for what we need to do in the future. And I think of a few things that are key in that space. So one is that the boundaries between the universities and the rest of society have tended to be quite well defined. In the future, they'll need to be much softer, and there'll need to be a much greater flow and interaction between the public sector and the private sector more broadly and what's happening within the universities. The funding for universities that's attached to individual students will need to think more about the different costs associated with different types of students and their different backgrounds. At the moment, to graduate a student in engineering, I'm paid the same funding if that student was the top of the class in science in their year at Hamilton Boys or Hamilton Girls, as I am for a student who's come from a small provincial high school and needs a significant amount of support to get into the position where they can complete an engineering degree. We have 8 universities in New Zealand, and while sometimes people say the question is whether we should have 8 universities, for me the question is why is it that they all do this pretty much the same things? And while we might say that it's good to have a uniform university system, when you look at the really strong university systems in other parts of the world, a key characteristic that they have is the diversity of the institutions that they call universities and the diversity of the things that they're doing. So I applaud the government's recent suggestion that they're looking at a model of a dual sector university institution. Such universities exist in Australia and in other countries, and it's an obvious thing for us to consider as the government is thinking about the future of the institutions that became part of Te Pūkenga as well as the university system. So that's probably enough for a start. Thank you, Matt.
There's plenty in that. Thank you, Neil.
Yep.
Rawinia, I'll pass to you, and I'm interested in your view at the highest level of what's going on in the system, but particularly it's come up in another conversation we had around what the value of a university education is. Why do we or why should we value them in society, or do we value them too much?
Tēnā koe, o tira tēnā koutou katoa. Tātou ko hui mai nei ki tēnei takiwā I raro I te maru o te kingitanga. Tēnā hoki koutou. It's interesting, as we were talking about, review, being under review again, so I'm an arts person. I have an arts degree, and interestingly, not always seen as a valuable degree. But I did note in the Public Service Commissioner talking around the specialists, generalists, largely arts people, they're able to bring that in terms of that critique and analysis. But because I'm also a language person, particularly in te reo, I've kind of cottoned on and thought about today's kōrero around the letter R, probably because my name starts with R, and I like the reo, that starts with R. But thinking about review and reform and regulation, I've been in the academy for a long time, in 30 years, and I've seen many, many reviews come and go. And often I'm kind of, when you're the minority in a university, you get to sit and you watch it and how people react to reforms and reviews. And for me, I do wonder around, where this review will take us in terms of our education system has been rationed in many ways, like the whole system. And then that pipeline comes through to universities and it's still in a rationed form. Will this just be the rearranging of deck chairs? Will it look like a reform, but actually kind of just be the same? Because there has been limited, investment in research and development. We kind of get separated out in terms of those barriers of what people think they're getting in terms of the value of the degrees that we have, and whether they translate into moving fast enough to keep up with the economy and business. And I think there is a balance to kind of how we think about that. I think the lack of investment in education writ large in this country has often devalued and conscientised and enculturated us to devalue our perception on the value of education, whether it's through the degree, a postgraduate degree, or even just in our compulsory sector. Because we've seen the undervaluing of and the underinvestment in education. And so consequently, when you are challenged and your education system has been living on rations, it's hard to kind of see, is there value in it?
I might return to that and I'll be interested in other panellists' views on the rationing concept. Thank you. Roger, what's your take? And for the group, it's probably useful if you can give the snapshot view of the current review that Rawinia has just referred to, because the university sector is under a twin review currently with the science sector. So if you can give us an understanding.
Right, well, thank you. We're all waiting for this, the results of this review, which is due later this month. When that review was set up in 2024, nobody really said what problem that review was going to solve. When you look at the data on university performance, well, graduates get jobs, graduate unemployment is negligible, there's a healthy premium for graduates in employment, and the system's moderately efficient, completion rates are okay. So, it made me think, is this really a review that's actually in search for a problem? Now, there are certainly issues with university performance, there always will be. One is equity of achievement, but there's work underway on that issue. Another is to do with the structure of the funding system, and Neil alluded to this in his introduction too. That was thrown into relief when COVID came and the international student market collapsed and then took a long time to recover, and that threw into relief the questions about the structure of the funding system. So there was a review underway on that specific question, but that's now been superseded by this more comprehensive review. So if we ask, well, what can we expect out of this review? Well, maybe there'll be some mechanical things like proposals for process simplification. Well, that might be okay, that's a good thing. Some comments about structure and funding. I'm sure there will be plenty of hand-wringing about the eternal problem of how the education system, or the universities in particular, are delivering for the labour market. And there might also be questions about, they might also raise some issues about some of the low-value expenditure in the tertiary education system, particularly the fees-free scheme, and the question of the way the student allowances scheme work. But so when you have a review that hasn't got a clearly defined problem, it runs the risk of blurring the questions about that are really important in the system. I mean, this is just one example, but if you look at the research performance of New Zealand universities, they're okay, that's right on the world average. But if you compare us with other small countries of a similar size, they tend to perform better than us on most metrics for research. If you compare us with Ireland, Ireland is a country of the same population as us. It's got very similar funding for or resourcing for its institutions, and yet they are significantly ahead of us in research performance. One of the things that's characteristic of our system that's unusual, this again is another point that Neil made, is its relative homogeneity. There is relatively little difference in performance across our 8 universities on most metrics, including research, compared with other countries. That homogeneity at one level is a great strength, because it means that we can offer our students a reasonable level of university education wherever they go in the system. But maybe there's a trade-off there. Maybe one of the consequences of that homogeneity is reflected in that very middling performance on research. So those are some of the kinds of things that we ought to be perhaps thinking about out of the review. There's also a more fundamental question. Both Rawinia and Neil talked about the university system in the context of the broader education, of the broader tertiary education system. One of the things that troubled me when the review was set up was that the university system was probably the part of the system that was functioning best, that was functioning moderately well. And yet that's been the focus of this major strategic review. Whereas the foundation education system, the programs that are set up to cater for people who leave school with low achievement and who face the risk of unemployment and of poor outcomes, that part of the system is demonstrably failing. Yet a lot of the government's energy has gone into focusing on the part of the system which is working best. Now, obviously, the rationale is that the universities are very much drivers of economic growth, drivers of innovation, and to that extent, a well-functioning university system is an important part of a healthy modern society. But it does make me worried about the lack of focus in that review.
Thank you, Roger. All right, there are a number of themes that have come out from each of you, and also some questions coming through from the audience. I'm going to start with an audience question and tie it back to something you said, Rawinia, so this is coming to you. The question was around how the recent defunding of social sciences and humanities affect the place of universities within society. So I think there's that. First, can you just explain a little bit around recent Marsden Fund decisions, including what the Marsden Fund is and what's happened there. But also, I'm interested in your view around, you've kind of already put out your stall, around social sciences versus hard sciences, and in context of what the government's announced in some comments this morning from Minister Willis around an emphasis on growth. What do you think is trying to be achieved? Do you agree with it? What do you wish might be different?
Okay, there's a lot in what you just asked me, so let me try and unpack it a little bit. I think, and also conscious of the fact that we're in the graveyard shift of all conferences, so maybe I'll spice it up a little bit.
You go.
So one of the things that, I listened to the minister, but I also was thinking about this before I came in terms of how reviews happen, and sticking with my theme of R, and this might make people feel uncomfortable, but I have over time kind of seen some of the reviews and reforms in the tertiary education system as being a rationalisation for racism. And I'll give it some context, because I did talk about before there's hardly, the government doesn't invest a lot in research funding, and so the Marsden has been one of those, funds that we've had to draw from, and it's a highly competitive fund. But when I think about some of the reforms when I first started as a junior academic, where, the volume-based funding that Neil was talking about before, kind of the wānanga kind of proliferated pretty quickly. And of course there was the sense that they were growing faster at the rate of knots than universities were. And so of course we introduced PBRF and performance-based research funding, which became a big part of how we were also funded. And of course, universities in that competitive spirit of wanting to be able to publish and do more and demonstrate that they were better at doing research, competed in that, and we continued to until recently, and then PBRF was stopped after we'd done a whole lot of work in terms of setting up the next set of, criteria. And then I kind of think about, the increased engagement with Mātauranga Māori, and then, we have the stops and the cuts into the Marsden that kind of helps to limit how much we invest into not just humanities and social science, but the assumption that Mātauranga Māori only exists in that space, when actually it exists in all sorts of spaces, including science and technology. And this is, on the background of also no increases in the equity funding for Māori and Pacifica. And Neil kind of touched on that in terms of being able to support those who have not necessarily had access to education in a strong kind of way. So there's one way to kind of think about, using my R word again, like how we think about some of these reforms. Are they just insidious, moves to, to eliminate or downgrade that? And yet when I read that report from the minister in the first chapter, talked about the Māori economy being the fastest growing economy. And then I looked at the education section in there, and that there's yet again a new plan, and we want to talk about evidence-based success opportunities where Kura Kaupapa Māori has already demonstrated that they have high success rates in their NCEA, but now we're going back to assuming that Māori need to have literacy and numeracy again. So I think there are already models there that are driven by Māori. They're not being picked up. The evidence show it. Let's do another review. We're going to introduce something else. So I'm always a little bit sceptical on that, and just kind of that thread that continues to run through in the way we think about education and how we think about what are the opportunities we could be investing in based on that evidence, but instead we take some of those opportunities away by the way we think about research and universities and the way we fund us.
Thank you. I'm going to pass to you in a moment, Neil. There are a range of questions that come in that I'll stitch together. Some are around themes we heard this morning. Are universities or elements of university education redundant in a world of AI? There's an interesting question around whether or not university students are going out ready to contribute and live in the world. How do you think about the role of universities in an emerging technology environment, but also what universities need to do to make sure that the students leaving these halls go out and are ready?
Yep. Thanks. Before I pick up that, can I just add a couple of things on the social sciences? Because obviously this university has a strong social science and arts program. So I think it's unfortunate that they've been singled out for the reasons Rawinia has said, that people who study arts and social sciences learn really important skills that contribute to our economy and to our society. It's also a bit unusual to take the approach that's been taken, in the sense that you can't, on the one hand, say that you support the freedom of academics and universities to pursue the things that they think are important, and then say, oh, well, we actually don't like what you've decided is important, so we're going to change the funding regime to fix that. But actually, the social sciences and the arts will have a future, and I use my own career as an example of that. I started my life as an economic historian, got a job in an economics department where the leading people in the department said, well, to get tenure here, you'll have to publish in the top 30 mainstream economics journals. We don't like those low-quality economic history journals, so you'll have to change what you're doing. And of course I did. You respond to the incentives, and I think our social scientists and our arts people will respond to the implicit challenge there of building alliances with other parts of the university and finding ways to access research funding nonetheless. I think, Matt, sorry, just to come back to your question.
So and could be connected, the theme of the follow-up was, what are universities doing, or what do universities need to do in order to prepare people to go out into the world?
That's right. So that's my softening the boundaries point. We're under a lot more pressure to think about the employability of our graduates than was true 30 years ago, and I think that's appropriate. So at this university, but the others in New Zealand as well, people are putting a lot more effort into encouraging students to think about the fact that given so many of them are working part-time, how does that relate to what they're studying? And we have work-integrated learning papers here in the curriculum across the whole university that encourage the students to actually make a link between the formal study that they're doing and the part-time work or internships. So it's very explicit in degrees like engineering that you have to do that, but we're trying to get all of our students to think in that way. But the softening of the boundaries also means we'll need to have a lot more visibility and a lot more engagement with organisations who are potential employers, so that they're involved in what's going on in the university. And that's actually important for the research effort as well, because if we're going to raise our research performance, we can't just do it by the government giving more money to the universities to do more research. We're going to have to build partnerships with organisations outside the university and find ways into interesting research and co-funding by doing that. Some of that happens now, but if you look at other countries, other developed countries, a lot more of it happens there than happens in New Zealand at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. I've got a question for you, Roger, and it's a short one. Fees free, brought in by the previous government.
Yep.
First year, changed by the current government last year.
Yep.
We're in a constrained environment. It's got a cost. Is it working? Is it worth it?
One of the points about fees free is that, in my view, it was complete deadweight expenditure because it didn't actually change people's behaviour. and making it first year or last year really actually makes no difference. The reason it made no difference to participation is that the factors that go into deciding why somebody is going to go into tertiary education, they have their origins way back in the person's background, and the financial side of it is is only a very small part of the motivation. In fact, because of our interest-free student loan scheme, there is actually no liquidity, no real financial cost that is met by the student in paying the fees until they are well past, they've graduated, they're in the workforce, and then they get the benefit of paying off their loan a little earlier, so that they get a financial benefit from fees-free 6, 7, 8 years after leaving study, at the very point when they're already earning and therefore in much less need of it. So it makes it made no sense. And if you look at the data, it actually showed that there is no statistically measurable difference in participation as a consequence of fees-free. Shifting it to final year is equally of no value, because how is that going to change anybody's incentives? Everybody has an incentive to pass. So why would it make any difference? So from my point of view, there are other places in the system where that money could be spent to much, much greater value.
Rawinia, I'm interested in your view on that subject, but also you've talked about rationing education, potentially not investing enough in it. Do you have the same view as Roger, but also if we were to allocate that funding somewhere else to expand access to education, how would you like to see it done?
I think and I was thinking about, as Roger was talking, and Neil kind of started us off on a history lesson, that part of, one of the things around when fees first got introduced is not dissimilar to when the welfare system happened in this country. So there's a kind of an analogous parallel history that's running along there, that, we've always we've built the sense of dependency on that, and the limited amount of funding that comes out is not dissimilar to when you get your benefit. And so the fees-free is just another one of those mechanisms to kind of dangle an incentive, which is kind of, you're still relying on that state funding, that, okay, whether I do it in my first year or if I do it in my last year. So I'm kind of a little bit sceptical about it. I think, that the way we kind of value and we talk about education, and education as a whole, has kind of conditioned us to kind of be in that, oh, well, we are not quite as good enough in our system.
How do you mean, sorry?
Well, in the way that we've underinvested in it, and then we criticise it, and we say we're not as good as anyone else, and we don't think about, what investment we're putting back in to improve our system. We just kind of critique, and then we talk about, let's go overseas and send our children overseas because they will get a better education, or they need to do the, I can't remember what they do it in the fancy schools.
You mean executive education?
Yeah, those sort of
Yes.
things. So,
yes.
I think there's, we perpetuate that sense that we are a lesser than education system because we're kind of been rationed out, and so we make do with what we can, and then we don't invest in to improve it, and that's right across the board. So we just stick, governments stick sticky tape on it or band-aids on it when it's kind of hemorrhaging, and so the comparisons that are made, yeah, we're the same size, we might have the same similar kind of funding systems, but they are quite different in terms of the type of education and the pipeline of education, but also the conscientisation in families that education is an important part of success and how we think around growth and economy. So, part of my engagement hat for the university is, working with people, alumni and international partners, and they are just totally conditioned into university is the norm, not the exception. It's just part of that pathway to success. We don't have that same. We're still down in we're not passing the NCEA.
Yeah. Neil, I'm interested in your view, but also I wanted to, if you can, pick up on the point you made earlier about the funding system you get as the leader of a university for somebody who was dux of their college in a high decile area coming in versus somebody who maybe is coming from a background with less privilege, and for a university you get the same funding. How might that be different?
Just for a start on funding generally, this year it'll be 40 years since I got my first job as an academic at a university. And I've never known a time when people didn't say that the university system was underfunded. That's a constant. But the interesting question is always, well, but how do we use the funding? I say, to use a bit of economics, that the costs in the university system are endogenous. That is, they are whatever we let them become, because academics will find interesting things to do with more money if the more money is available. So really it's important to think about the incentives that we have to use money in particular ways. And the way I've thought about it is this: in the last 15 years, as the system has got to the point where it's not growing particularly, and there's more pressure on the universities to show effort in learner support and learner success and good employment outcomes, then it's obviously a lot more costly to support students who've come from disadvantaged backgrounds than it is from students who have been to high achieving schools and come from middle income families where both the parents are professionals. We have a funding system that pays the same amount of money per student at the moment, because 20 years ago we probably couldn't have done anything different. But of course now, with all sorts of people doing research that involves the IDI suites and the ability to track all sorts of socioeconomic indicators into the university system, we could do much better. And there's a real challenge, I think, for the public sector to get on top of that question of how the Tertiary Education Commission could adjust the funding so that it supports the incentives they're trying to give us.
So I'm going to continue on the funding thing. I think my first week in the university system, I asked for a budget. And like many people looking at budgets in 2020, if you were relying on people that came across the border, it was looking pretty stark. We felt a bit like a tourism business. Neil, what's your take on international students as essentially the swing source of income into the New Zealand university system? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it just inevitable? Is it something we should be doing less of or more of?
Matt, the starting point is to say, we have reasonable numbers of international students here, but if you think about the debates in other countries, they're about proportions of international students that are way higher than anything we have here. So the change in immigration policy in Australia has been about the fact that Sydney and Melbourne and New South Wales have 50% international students, which means that in their business schools they're 80% international. So that changes the nature of the universities in a significant way. I don't think New Zealand universities are in that situation. We're currently sitting around 18 to 20% international. The key thing about those international students is that we have to use the additional revenue that comes with them to invest in the system and not let it fall straight into our costs, which is, of course, something that tends to very easily happen in the university system. So what you'd look for, and if I was the monitor for the tertiary system, I'd be looking for higher surpluses from the universities in the years in which they had significant international enrolments to buffer the times when they perhaps had to live off their balance sheet to get through something like the pandemic. That wasn't the way we were acting pre-2019. We were acting as though 20% international was a permanent state of the world. And of course, we found out that maybe that's not the case.
Mm.
But one of the ways you could think about that is having more international students, potentially to enculturate them in our country, because they might make up our future workforce, because we make little investment in growing our current youth population of Māori and Pacifica.
Mm.
So unless we're going to strike a balance between, investing in Māori, and I think Brad talked about it this morning, making those investments in youth, rather than, the report, rather than investing in the dying, then, there's one way to think about it. International students, they come, they get to learn, they come to be part of our country because they'll probably end up making up our workforce because we underinvest in education at the other end of that scale. And Māori just happen to be in that space.
Mm. We sat on the stage 12 months ago with Paul Spoonley and others and just looked at the declining domestically born birth rate and just how fast our population is declining overall, notwithstanding the Māori population is growing and is an enormous percentage of our youth coming through. Roger, there's a theme of questions coming through here, and it's actually something Neil touched on at the start, but I'll go to all of you on this one. It's around competition versus collaboration, and this is something that Sir Peter Gluckman's review group has also looked at for the government. We have 8 universities, many of them do the same things, many of them do them in same things in pretty similar ways. Do we have too much competition? Do we have too little competition? How do we strike that balance?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting feature of our system. One of the things, if you've been in the system for a long time, as I have, one of the important changes that occurred when we moved to a more competitive system was it did improve performance. It added an edge. And I think that there is little doubt that some competition in the model will improve services, it will improve the way in which students are taught, and it will lift the research output and so on. So I think that there is a place for competition. On the other hand, there are times when competition can be destructive. So there's a Goldilocks spot, a sweet spot where that allows collaboration and working together at the same time without taking away the edge that competition can give. And we saw this during the, one of the things that I thought was most interesting, in the financial crisis that arose in the universities post-pandemic, it raised questions about the future of small subjects, subjects that had small enrolments that may be offered in several places around the country. Now, the institutions, there was nothing to prevent them from working together on that, and they have gone ahead and done so between Victoria and Otago. I'm aware of that case. So in other words, there isn't any impediment to sensible collaboration, collaboration and working together and cooperation where that makes sense. But at the same time, that doesn't actually stop, say, Victoria and Otago being competing in other areas. So I think that there's a balance to be found in the policy and funding settings that allows cooperation where it makes sense, but that doesn't take away an edge of competition between institutions.
Unless, of course, you
Rawinia,
try and
what's
build
your-
a
I'll go to Rawinia then. What's your take, Rawinia? You've been doing engagement, you've been engaging with other universities here, abroad. What's your take?
I was building off on what Roger just said and said to Neil that unless, of course, you're trying to build a medical school and you see the competition come out in force.
That will be discussed very briefly in the drinks section. But what's your take? Do you think, okay, so at one extreme, you've got the university in New Zealand with 8 branches, say to take an extreme to just test out an idea, and another, you've got far less regulation and you've got 8 or possibly more institutions that enter the market. What do we have today? Supermarkets, banks and energy, but nobody said complete deregulation of tertiary education to allow new entrants. But do you think we've got the settings about right? Would you like to see more collaboration, more competition?
I think there's been, over time, there have been opportunities to do a lot of collaboration. I think there already is a lot of competition. The volume-based funding model already has us competing with each other, and so everyone's, picking around the margins to try and outdo one another. And then you kind of get disciplinary attitudes that will try and stop that competition in many ways. So I think, there is a lot of competition. I think some of the funding, external funding opportunities that try to force us into collaborating still had people trying to want to stay quite siloed. So I do think there are some opportunities for collaboration. But I think that's collaboration can't just happen on the rations again. And that's when you end up competing. So everyone talks collaboration and say, yeah, as long as they get their share of the rations. And that's always going to be a challenge because it's an underinvested space. We're not very good at doing investment in R&D. We don't support, our knowledge economy. And so we undervalue it, and consequently we end up competing with each other. It's a little bit of a vicious cycle in many ways.
Thank you. Neil, what's your take?
Well, I could say a lot about competition, but I'll try to be brief. The point you raised, that there was mention of the banks and the supermarkets, energy companies, but not universities, is interesting because actually the 8 universities are very like the banks, but even more so in the sense that the boundaries of the universities, the name university, the Vice-Chancellor's committee are all enshrined in legislation. So, you show me an industry where the industry association is enshrined in legislation, and I'll show you an industry where actually there could be more competition. What happens is that we compete vigorously, but within very narrow channels, because the legislation requires that if I want to teach a new program, or I want to teach an existing program in a very different way, then I need to have the support of the University of Auckland and all the other universities in the country to do that. We have a group framework for accreditation of our programs, which is a huge constraint on the innovation that occurs in teaching programs in the country. So universities being self-accrediting is a standard model in many other countries. New Zealand is very unusual in requiring each university to get the support of every other university in the country to do anything. And so there's some real opportunities there to change that. Hopefully one day there'll be a Minister of Education who's interested in having a thoroughgoing look at the tertiary part of the Education Act.
Maybe this review might be the chance. All right, we've got a couple of minutes left, and so I'm just going to go down the panel. I'll start back at you, Roger, and come back this way. We're talking here about unconstrained thinking. We've had a couple of other interesting discussions on different policy areas, but if you had the levers, you've got the keys to the kingdom for a year or two. what are one or two changes you would want to see happen in the university system to improve its effectiveness?
Right. Well, for a start, I would want to focus to spend much more time looking at the data about what works, and looking at the data about the characteristics of the student and that sort of thing, to try and form a better picture of the environment in which universities are supposed to operate. And I think that now that's not an answer, a structural answer, if you like, but I think that there needs to be a much clearer focus on ensuring that the universities are serving the national need for skills and that sort of thing. That's something that the universities can't do alone. They need to work alongside other agencies. I think that there would need to be a much clearer focus on ensuring that we get better equity out of the system by making sure that we remove the obstacles to achievement that there currently are. So,
thank you. Rawinia, you're dictator for a day. What do you do?
Just a day.
I'll give you a month, give you a year.
Every
What
day
should I
then.
say? It's going to take a while. I think we need to be able to have a plan that works on that long term, trying to fix up their pipeline, our talent pipeline, in terms of education as a whole and how that's actually connected to the tertiary sector. And then I think, kind of at a micro level, because I'm a language planner, so I like to think long term and short term, is what are the opportunities to kind of do reform that doesn't kind of get us fighting at the margins again, but actually thinks about how we can either collaborate or be competitive, and investing in that youth side, and not always seeing universities as kind of a drain on society, but also enhancing. I think in the AI section, I listened to, how there was a philosopher in one of those teams, and, the importance of seeing education as not just one set of skills, and that there are that specialists and there are generalists, and they kind of come together in that collaboration of a workforce that kind of thinks about opportunities rather than, I'm challenged because I don't have X degree or I don't have the skill, et cetera, as we kind of think around education as the opportunity to move forward in the future. But there's a lot of infrastructure to fix.
Yeah. I think a theme I picked up from Nicola Willis's comments today was, a lot of these things are going to take a lot more than an election cycle. That does take more than a month or a year. So I think long-term thinking is valuable.
Oh, absolutely. But then you look at the plan, and the plan looks like, again, rearranging the deck chairs in terms of what we do. And so, I read the Māori education plan, and I just thought, here we go again. It's just got a different name. It's the same thing with a different name. There's some ticks next to it. And yet, in the narrative inside that report, talks around, increased youth Māori population. So how do we think about a future economy that is under-educated? And so then we have to kind of rely on immigration to prop up an aged Pākehā community. So I feel like we're looking at it all in the wrong kind of way, just doing the same thing, moving it around with some more rations. So I don't know, I'm all about sceptical, but I want to be optimistic. Because, the more the Māoria, I say.
Haven't heard that one. And Neil, to close.
Well, actually, just to support what Rawinia has just said, take a more social investment approach to the funding of universities. That would be a good start. But if it was for me, I would deregulate the sector, remove the barriers to entry, allow the existing universities to become much different institutions if they thought there was a business case to do that, and encourage new entry if there were such wanted in.
Very interesting. Brilliant. All right, that's time for this panel discussion. So just before we move to the next, can we please put our hands together for our panellists? Thank you.